Good evening. I must say it's a great pleasure to be back at this podium after an absence of many years. And it's great to be with Graham Nixon again, and Lexi Campbell. I want to thank you and Joshua and everyone who has participated in this event for this evening. Given the presumed inevitability, I'll start over. Given the presumed inevitability of the virtual domain in today's world, ranging from economic totalism to medical science, my comments this evening will be to re-examine the fundamental importance of the tactile sensation in art through concrete examples, and in doing so to rethink the experience in art of aesthetic receivership as one in which tactile involvement or sensation plays a preeminent role in terms of how we think about objects and ideas in the 21st century. Am I getting a feedback on this? Yeah? Oh. Okay. The tactile approach, is that better? Yes. Oh. Well, let's see how it goes, and if it's a problem, just let me know. The tactile approach, where one's manner of touch retains its value in relation to virtual reality, is becoming increasingly rare. As simplistic reasoning has come to avoid complexity and necessary contradictions, the implications are far-reaching. Science is encroaching upon art in a distant way. We have entered a brave new world in which the tactile has been stimulated, or simulated, that is, by the haptic and thereby passed into the realm of the virtual. Is it possible that thought, as a human counterpart to feeling, is on the verge of extinction? Hopefully not. But let's take a look at where advanced art has gone over the past 50 years and try and determine where we are today. Before I get to the slides, I want to say a couple more things. My assumption is that history is important, as it is ineluctably connected to experience and how we experience works of art. The opening phrase of my topic this evening on throwing down the key has two meanings. It came to mind one evening as I was preparing for a gathering at an artist's studio a considerable distance away, involving two subway transfers, that I recalled in New York in 1975 when I arrived here. The raw spaces in Lower Soho and Tribeca were not so far away. In fact, in those days, emerging artists, as it were, could live and work in Lower Manhattan, often in relatively large open spaces that cost relatively little to rent. There were no buzzers on the doors, and the lofts were rarely on the ground level. The standard procedure was to walk over to an artist's loft and call on a payphone or simply shout the person's name. In the latter case, a head would appear in the window upstairs and a twisted sock would be thrown down. Inside the sock was the key to the front door. Upon entering, we had to walk up to the fourth or fifth floor. This is because the elevators in those warehouse buildings generally stopped running after 6 p.m. Once there, our host would open the door. The excitement of this experience of seeing works of art in progress had an unmitigated impact, at least to me. To see these paintings and objects in the process of being made and to converse about them was a thrill. There were no texts, no preambles, just the work. We would drink wine, have dinner, and continue talking late into the evening, sharing ideas about where art was going and the importance of what we believed we were doing. It was about energy. Money rarely, if all, entered the conversation. Selling art was not the point. It was not on the agenda. Rather, it was about making convincing work that an artist's friend or colleague would understand and ultimately support. On throwing down the key also has another meaning, but one necessarily related to the first. It refers to a kind of generosity, which was considered indigenous to being an artist at that time. We were all part of the same world. There was the frame of mind. To give someone the keys to the entrance of where one worked and made art was a sharing experience, a tactile engagement. it was an invitation to empowerment, to enter into the creative process, rather than an elitist agreement to isolate oneself, putting up a guard filled with ideological constraints. It was a different world in those days, a different way of becoming an artist. It was an existence that put art in front of everything else, a world in which materials and ideas were the construct of art, the excitement that gave art its power and its sensibility, that the unknown was important, as was the known, that the unrealized was as necessary as that which could be realized. It was the offering that art could fulfill a place in society that was not simply about the status of wealth, but an entry into human history, a respect for artists who were attempting to evolve a spiritual understanding of what the world was about, in essence, to open the threshold of creativity to make a better world. I would like my talk to begin by introducing artists that worked according to this energy and who embedded ideas within provocations of energy. They understood the body of a signifier of art in relation to the medium in which they worked. What I was trying to say there is that in those days, I'm talking about the 70s, the issue of the body in art first came into being. And there was a considerable discourse, and I think largely related to the rise of feminism. At that time, this was extremely important. This tendency made a grand appearance, the appearance of the tactile in the late 50s and continued through the early 70s, then sporadically but inconsistently continuing into the present. There are many more examples of artists working this way than I am able to show you this evening, but I have pared it down to a group of artists that I feel are extraordinary and who do indeed represent this tactile sensation, this allowance for vulnerability through time, that is, understanding time as putting one in a vulnerable state of mind. Okay, I'm going to begin. Let's see, it was on the wrong side. Did I do, oh. Let's see if I can get this right. No, there we go. Thank you. Okay, some of you may recognize Alan Capro. Alan Capro had large influence on me because I have to say that in the mid-70s was when I began my dissertation on conceptual art at NYU, the first dissertation to be written on conceptual art. Alan's parents always saw him as the professor, not the artist. And so I thought I would give a relatively unknown image of Alan because he looks very professorial here as we look at him, his image. Now, Capro was important because he brought time into space, because he understood the vulnerability of being an artist at that time. He understood the kind of sensitivity that was necessary to share with others in terms of recognizing and respecting others that were attempting to make a presence through art and in art. Most people associate Capro with the happenings, but in fact, the activities, as they were cited by Michael Kirby, the writer who wrote a great deal about Capro at the time, the activities came in 1973, and they were much more intimate, and they involved either 2, 4, or 6 people, sometimes 8. I can think of one that had 8. But the point is that people would interact according to a script that Capro had written, and there would be an opportunity to come together at the end of the performance, or the activity as it was called, which tended to be very stark and very precise. For example, one involved the taking of the pulse, and then the taking of the pulse over the phone, which was quite extraordinary, and counting the numbers as one was taking the pulse. This was a tactile reality, and it was so close to art, I have to say. Even at that time in my career, I recognized its importance. But all of this has to do with the fact that the action became important in relation to the work. And a lot of this, I think, was taken from Merleau-Ponty at the time, who, as we know, was very influential on the work of Harold Rosenberg in terms of defining what Rosenberg called action painting. And Capro was very interested in action painting. And after the death of Pollock in 1956, he wrote a memorial tribute that Tom Hess held off for 2 years because Paul Goodman had done a similar essay that got priority for some reason. But Capro's was much deeper from my point of view, and he understood the contribution of Pollock, not so much about the paintings themselves, but the new idea of action in terms of how a painting was made. This is what Capro was interested in, because he felt that if you were engaged in this kind of action while painting, why not go outside the boundaries, which in fact Pollock did, but why not go further outside the boundaries so that you were actually entering into real space and real time. And of course, that was the beginning of here we are with Pollock. Here, I purposely used this photograph of Hans Nemeth to illustrate exactly what influenced Capro, because this is the kind of image that was shown and was printed in Art News at that time by Tom Hess, and he was fascinated that painting could exist in this way, and he saw it as a new energy, a new possibility. I think implicitly he was bending toward the East, and I'll come to that a little bit later in my remarks. Okay, there were many people who followed the course of Pollock in terms of this idea of throwing or pouring material. In this case, it's throwing lead. And this is Richard Serra back in 1969-70 when he was coming into a post-minimal place, so to speak, highly influenced by people like Donald Judd and Carl Andre. And the post-minimalists were primarily Richard Serra and Eva Hess, who I'm going to speak about in a moment, but also Keith Saunier and the guy that I wrote the book about, Bruce Nauman. Okay, these were the four artists that generally constituted post-minimalism. And what post-minimalism was, essentially, is people who borrowed from people like Andre and Judd, and of course Saul DeWitt was initially a minimalist before he became a conceptualist, and Dan Flavin. These people were monuments who had established a new tendency, and I hesitate to say trend because that usually has economic implications, so I'm going to say it was a tendency that was extremely important and had worldwide implications. But from the point of view of New York, there would be this group that would take some of these, what Michael Fried called reductivist art, okay, and transform it into something else. There was the idea of the resistance and the transformation. Those two elements created this new energy that Serra was largely involved in. Keep in mind, these were long before the torqued ellipses. They were long before he was working with steel to the extent that we understand that today. Okay, now this is a rare photograph of Eva Hess that I was able to find because I didn't want to show the typical photographs that are often shown, and I think it's an extraordinarily beautiful photograph of her, and I think it demonstrates this kind of arbitration of tactility. That is to say that, you know, the retina in fact, can have a tactile relationship with an object. And I think that that's important. Also, we have to understand that as the retina is having that tactile relationship with an object, the retina is also what Aldous Huxley used to call windows to the brain, okay? There's that synaptical charge that is making us think. This is a kind of Duchampian point of view, of course. But the point is that we are thinking, seeing, experiencing the touch of the object that we are seeing. Now, this all came into a kind of minimal influence, and the idea of modularity became very important. And of course, Eva, who began as a painter, studied with Joseph Albers, as you know, and later married the sculptor Tom Doyle, who, a great sculptor, by the way, who did not have a minimal point of view. His point of view was closer to Franz Klein, the idea of a kind of expressionist point of view, working with wood, of course, beautiful objects. But she was much more interested in what Sol LeWitt and what Nell Bachner were doing in terms of modularity, that is, the repetition of the form. And she transformed this, of course, into something that was biomorphic and organic, and gradually became assumed into the kind of symbology of the body and a kind of feminist aesthetic. One of her comments in her last essay that she did with Cindy Nemser in 1970, "I want to give greater significance to my art," says Hess. "I want to extend my art perhaps into something that doesn't exist yet." It's a rather sad comment in a way, but heroic at the same time. It's a marvelous comment because it really shows her extraordinary faith in what she was doing and how far she had come in a relatively short period of time. We can't ignore the contribution of Robert Smithson, and I chose a work from 1968 called The Walk Through the Yucatan in Mexico, in which he is placing a group of 9 mirrors in various locations during the course of his walk. The idea was to find sacred spaces among the Mayan Indians in the region of the Yucatan and to place the mirrors at an angle that would catch the sun and therefore bring the spirit to the ground and send the spirit up from the ground back to the heavens. Now, Smithson was essentially, among other things, I mean, certainly the spirituality of what he was doing was very much the case, but also there was a much more analytic side to Smithson. As we know, he was interested in the deconstruction of art, the deconstruction of the gallery and all the evanescences connected with that, and also the deconstruction of the museum. And in fact, if one had to point toward an artist's source for institutional critique, I believe it would be Robert Smithson. I believe that he is the first to really come up with a notion of the anti-monument, which is part of the institutional critique. So he's extremely important in this. Now, what I want to suggest is that if you want to call this theory, okay, you can call it that. I mean, certainly he has ideas and so forth. But it was emanating from the work itself. Do you follow what I'm saying? In other words, it wasn't superimposed from the outside. It wasn't reading a text by Rudolf Carnap and saying, you know, this is what I'm going to do. It was finding the work within the object, finding the work within the material. I think that this is enormously important today because we have too much of what I call the a priori text or the foregrounded text, where in order to understand somebody's work, we have to read the text. That's not art. That's not art. You don't read the text to understand what you're seeing. You pull out from what you're seeing into something that is significant, that you can put into a language. The real language of art is a posteriori, to use the Kantian duality that I'm talking about, not the a priori. To pull it out and therefore to create a truly critical exegesis in relation to the work, which I feel Smithson was doing. Okay, my temptation was to show you a large portion of wall floor positions from 1969 by Bruce Nauman. However, I showed a couple clips instead. I would recommend wall floor positions as something to watch. It's an hour in length. It's highly underrated, in my opinion. I think those early video works are phenomenal. And it has so much to do with the tactility that I'm referring to. This is body and mind, okay? He is not repeating those positions. In other words, he has to, at an interval, think of what he has done in order not to repeat it a second time. What I mean is the body is on the floor and the wall. There are a couple instances during the tape where he's totally on the floor without touching the wall, which are kind of like the pauses in concerto, for example, you know, where you stop and you ruminate in terms of where you're at in the piece. But what is truly remarkable about this is if you think that it's an hour long, that the movement changes every 15 seconds. That means there are, let's see, if, there are over, how many? Over 200, if I'm not mistaken. 240, that's right. 240, that's exactly right. That he's doing 240 positions, each one unique in terms of how he's making contact with the wall and the floor. That's extraordinary. Now, this is not something that, I mean, he did some rehearsal undoubtedly, but it's not like he is mapping out something and simply doing it, but he is in the act. It's the action of the body working in relation to this process, which I find extraordinary. I always felt the tension in this work, and then I figured it out. 240 positions that would change equidistantly in time over the course of an hour, where he would be touching floor and wall. It's an extraordinary piece. Okay, I'm going to just show you a photograph of Gerhard Richter with his large squeegee, and I have to say that much to probably the unpopularity of this artist, I don't know, but I think he's a great artist, and I think that this force of the surface, the necessary tension in search of light, is the way I would put it. And he remarks about that in the course of his film that I believe has been shown in this room, that in fact that he is trying to find the light coming out of the paint. Sometimes he's successful, sometimes he's not. Anyway, we're going to see a short clip just at the end because I think it's one of the most marvelous statements by a contemporary artist of our time right now. Okay, the evocation of a critical dialogue also begins to evolve in terms of formalism in the late 50s and 60s. A discourse in art arrives through the application of series, sequence, and linear chronology. Now, this is, in fact, both formalism and anti-formalism from my point of view. It leans heavily toward the conceptual. Some might consider this a minimal or conceptual way of working. And in the case of what I'm going to present, I think one could look at it from both of those ways. But in all cases, the work purposefully remains within the barricades of aesthetics. And I'm going to talk about three artists now. The first is Frank Stella. Is there water up here? Here it is. Okay, thank you. Ruth, I think you have this place memorized, right? Not only the place, but my talk is. Okay. I have to say this is one of my favorite early Stella paintings. What I'm going to do is attempt a kind of compressed critique of the recent exhibition at the Whitney, beginning by saying that I think Stella is really an amazing artist. Okay, there's little doubt for me in terms of the body of work that he has done and the way he has worked over time. This work is from 1965, metallic powder in polymer emulsion. And again, using the term of Michael Fried, it's a painting with a reductivist structure. Now, Fried was correct about that. He was correct to not equate minimalism too closely with Stella, because Stella was, after all, a painter. And if you take the writings of Donald Judd and Robert Morris seriously, the Notes on Sculpture I'm referring to in terms of the series of Robert Morris. Minimalism are objects that are in space, that you are interacting with. And they're modular, and they're repetitive, okay? But painting is something that is on the floor. There was a misnomer with an exhibition at the former Guggenheim over where the Prada is now on Lower Broadway. I can't remember what year it was exactly, I think about 12 years ago, called minimal painting. And minimal painting is an oxymoron, I'm sorry. It's like military intelligence. You can't have both, okay? You can be minimal in terms of, objects, but it has a very different meaning. And this is constantly coming up as being misunderstood. But I think that the two people who really clarified it were Judd and Robert Morris. Here's a statement that Stella makes in Painter's Painting, which I think is particularly appropriate. The whole thing about pattern, regulated pattern, was to keep the viewer from reading a painting. In other words, it had to do with an idea that seemed to be, if not new, at least somehow necessary to the time. Now, later on, he talks about how there's a kind of compulsiveness to this kind of painting, but it becomes holistic at the same time, and it doesn't have the jumps and starts that we begin to see in the later work, I would say beginning maybe in the late 70s, early 80s in particular. But the point is that he is functioning from the point of view of a painter. Later, he came out into space, as we saw in that last piece at the retrospective that is in the room where the overlook of the river is. I think it's dedicated to Vladimir Kazimir Malevich, and not Vladimir Tatlin, but it's supposed to be based on the square. There have been a number of artists who have based a painting on the square of Malevich, including Victor Vasarely, among others. But the list goes on and on. But the point is that we are seeing something here that is out of sequence. And I'm afraid in the work of Stella, the only way you can make sense of why the work is significant is to understand it in sequence. There were, for example, the Polish synagogues are spread out in a way that is nonsensical. There's only one good example of the protractor, which I consider one of his great series, and one major example. Things are put together that shouldn't be put together. For example, the paintings from 1959 that are dealing more with the structural idea at the beginning of his career shouldn't be confused with the work that he was doing, for example, dedicated to Astoria or Great Joan Street from '58. I mean, you can see why they relate, but they're not the same in terms of the thought process. There is thought in the work of Stella, as we know. I don't think we can deny that. And the problem is with this retrospective is that the thought was not evident in terms of how the work was placed. I think the problem is definitely it's an overcrowded show. I think that too much work, and I think that the idea of a curatorial schemata is simply not present. Let me show you the protractor that was in the show, which is called Heron 2, polymer and fluorescent. This is one of the earliest protractors from 1967, which I think is absolutely marvelous. It's hard to tell that on the screen, perhaps, but when you're right up against it and have the scale relationship to your body, it's unbelievable. And then I would like to show something that had a big influence, I think, on a lot of other recent work that Stella has done, which is on the wall but is beginning to come into the space, like this Malevich piece that I mentioned. This is called La Pena de Hu. It's translated The Peacock Feather. Stella began working on this in 1987, and he completed it. In other words, he found his resolution to this in 2009. That's a considerable length of time. Are we talking about 22 years, perhaps? It's etched magnesium, aluminum, and fiberglass. Now, I show this work because I think it's a very good work. There are other works that are in the show, perhaps less good, but they pick off from this idea, and they use different aspects of this, and those are flocked throughout the show. And I think for somebody who doesn't know the sequence of the evolution in terms of how the black paintings would, transform into the irregular polygons, and how that would later become the protractor series, and how those would lead to the Indian bird series and the synagogues and so forth. I mean, the circuitry, which is in the early 80s, a very important series, and not one of his best, but an important one nonetheless. I mean, one has to acknowledge that there's a difference. But the problem is that when we look at Stella, we understand it in terms of the moves that he is making in the course of his career, how he is thinking through the process, and how that thinking, again, is embedded in the work. It's not coming from the outside. It's not an imposed theory from the outside, which is the problem with 90% of the work today that we're seeing, not just Stella, I'm talking about other artists. Too much is coming from the outside in rather than coming from the inside out. And Stella was really in the work, in body and in mind, and ultimately in feeling, I have to say, when he really hit it. And occasionally he really hits it. More credit to Stella, and I hope we see more of that work in the years to come. I'd like to move on now to Saul Wich, and I'm sorry that this is somewhat blurred because it was a rather small image, not with the right density. And I'm going to just show you 3 wall drawings. These express a kind of evolution of space, an expansiveness, a depth as the work progresses. Eventually, color comes in, as we're going to see, and ultimately a great sense of tactility. Now, as we know, these were worked out by Saul Wich in his studio in Hester Street at that time, and later they would be turned over to his team, led by Joe Watanabe. And the work would be realized. And there were all kinds of possibilities for realizing the work, but there's a general schemata which was always important. What I would like to suggest is something that I've never heard anyone else say, and that is that the kind of, shall we say, serialization that I was expressing in relation to how one group of work follows another, how we see origins and diffractions and so forth in relation to a sequence of work or a series of work. Saul always referred to the term seriality because he liked that, and that was also present in his structures, which he insisted not on calling sculptures but structures, and he insisted on calling these wall drawings not paintings, because his whole idea was that after 1967 he had transformed into a conceptualist, and therefore he didn't want the connection with language that related to a kind of past dichotomy between painting and sculpture. He wanted something that was more unified in terms of a thought process. But what I would like to say in terms of the comparison with Stella is that both Wich and Stella are dependent on this kind of sequencing of groups of work. I think it's a little more maybe opaque in Wich, but not necessarily. It really depends on what you're seeing. But I think that it's important that we understand that these are not simply pulled out of thin air in terms of ideas that relate to geometry and painting. Rather, there is a kind of, for a better word, linearity, okay? Now, I think it was very difficult to talk about linearity in the 60s and 70s because everybody was talking about simultaneity, okay? And certainly it was in theater, it was in music, it was in film, and it was in the visual arts, that everything had to be simultaneous. Well, unfortunately, I think for Wich and Stella, that to really understand their work, we have to understand the linear progression and how it works. It's not that we can't honor the fact that they were in touch with their time. They were both extremely, are you kidding? How could they not be in touch with their time and do that kind of work? But the point is that they were really using a rather classical way of working. It has nothing to do with the Romantic, and it barely touches on something that we might call philosophical or conceptual, whatever. But the point is that they needed a classical structure in order to find the inventiveness that was necessary for the work. I'm going to show you one more. This, by the way, is not done with paint. It's done with inks that are burnished onto the wall, not painted. And you know, when I first saw this, it was at the old, after Castelli left that space in Soho on Green Street, it was turned over to, I believe, Gagosian. No, Pace, I'm sorry, Pace, and because there were two different spaces. This was the one that was right on Houston and Green. Anyway, the point is that I saw this for the first time, and my first thought was the Scottish designer McMurdo. If any of you know the Art Nouveau movement in terms of, you know, what was happening in Scotland at the time with Charles Rennie Mackintosh and so forth, and the appropriation of Klimt, you know, into the tea house and all that kind of thing, that Art Nouveau was very big. And I thought, oh my God, Saul is going back to Art Nouveau. And I remember writing that in a review, and I don't think he liked it much. But anyway, the point is, it's the way I saw it. But at this point, he was getting away from the language, because what was very important, I remember when I spoke with him on the phone back in 1977. I was in the throes of my dissertation, and he had just shown at the John Weber Gallery his 1974 piece, which was called the open cubes, right? In other words, it was 144 open cubes, beginning with 3 sides and ending with 11 sides. In other words, it couldn't be 2 because that would be too linear, but it could be 3 and it could be 11. Those would be open cubes, okay? And there were 144 variations. He worked with an Indian mathematician because they weren't using computers in those days. And he had an isometric drawing and a photograph of each of the cubes mounted on the wall. So the drawing and the photograph were on the walls. And then in the space on this low platform were these small maquettes, really, because later they would become much bigger, of the incomplete open cubes. And so I said, you know, I was asking Saul, I said, so there are 3 possibilities for interpreting what you mean, all of which are equal: the form, the photograph, and the drawing. And there was a long pause. And he said, there's a 4th. And I said, what's that? And he said, language. I thought it was very interesting. And so the language in the wall drawings was important up until this period. And this period would be around the very late 90s, coming into the 21st century. Of course, he didn't live that long into the 21st century, but the point is that he did an abundance of work at that time that was, frankly, not linguistic based. And of course, you know, the tried and true conceptualists were very much against it because they felt that the language was necessary. But I feel that some of these are extraordinarily beautiful. And even this, even though I made the connection with McMurdo, still I think it was beautiful. We cannot leave out Agnes Martin. I remember a statement that Saul made about Martin, that she gave me the grid. That was his statement. And of course, that happened in Coenties Slip when she was working with Ellsworth Kelly and Jack Youngerman and others before she left to go to New Mexico. So this is a 1962 grid. And this is a year later, 1963. I mean, these have a very urban feeling to me, and the light is not so much the issue as the form, at least from my point of view. But when she goes to Galisteo and does this is 1977, we really get the light. The grid leads toward the horizontal light of the prairie and its expansiveness. And here's a quote from Agnes Martin, which I think is a marvelous quote. As you know, she was a wonderful writer. Moments of awareness of perfection and of inspiration are alike, except that inspirations are often directives toward action. To feel insufficient, to experience disappointment and defeat, in waiting for inspiration is the natural state of mind of an artist. I think that there's something just so magnificent about that statement that I don't see as negative at all. I think it's really getting to the core of what it means to be a painter, okay? What it means to be an artist, all right? That there is that vulnerability of time where you're caught by time, you're in a state of doubt. But I think it's important to understand that doubt can also be a very fervent and positive way of thinking in terms of allowing the pause to happen. Frankly, I think there are a lot of artists out there nowadays who should take a pause, a hiatus, let's call it. Maybe they should go on vacation. There's too much work being made that I have to suffer with, among others. Okay. Now, I'd like to say just a general comment here in relation to this work by Magdalena Abakanowicz, whose work I've always loved, and because I haven't dealt with the figurative, I want to make sure that the figurative is not exempt from the kind of tactility that I'm talking about. We're talking about an Eastern European artist. True, she spends a lot of her time in Paris. There's no doubt about that. But keep in mind that these are not bronze. The bronze comes much later. This is the tactility of sewing, okay? In other words, the tactile feel of the threads and rough-hewn burlap. Now, one of the important openings that occurred in terms of what today perhaps we refer to as the globalized art world happened in 1989, a show curated by my colleague Jean-Hubert Martin, Les Magiciens de la Terre, okay, the magicians of the earth. That was bringing work into Paris from the continent of Africa, from South America, from Indonesia. It was bringing work from the Middle East, all over the Middle East, work from China, from Korea, from Southeast Asia, and, by the way, the United States, as well as European countries. But many of the works that he selected were very atypical and not part of what modernism was about, at least the way it had been defined by critics and art historians at the time. Jean-Hubert got tremendous flack for this, tremendous controversy. And I've learned through Obama that anytime you get controversy that intense, you must be doing the right thing, okay? And in the case of Les Magiciens de la Terre, I mean, this was a marvelous breakthrough. I mean, we knew very little about Poland other than the Polish constructivists before that exhibition. And Magdalena, of course, was very much connected to this sensibility of Eastern Europe and Central Europe and the former Baltic states and so forth. And her idea, the look of the work, is outside of the Western modernist idea. I always felt that from the moment I first saw it. I first saw her work in 1982, okay? And later, as I mentioned, she would take these burlap bags and they would be, she would make bronze maquettes and have them cast. But I love this early work of hers, where she stands as tall as her sculpture. And we have this sense that a human being made this work, an artist made this work. This is something that she did because she believed in it, because she needed to do it, because it was more than an agenda. It was something truly inspired. Okay, I want to go to 4 Asian artists now, and it's difficult to read this, but let's see. I think I have 2 paintings by Yoon Hyung Gun. Did any of you happen to see the exhibition at Blum and Poe about maybe 2 months ago? Okay, let me just give you the story in brief. Donald Judd is the only minimalist who ever went to Korea, and he went there by way of Japan. He knew my friend Takashi Yamaguchi, who I met obviously subsequently, and Takashi Yamaguchi had a gallery in Osaka. And he was very interested in the work being done in Korea, largely through the influence of Joan, who is now represented by Pace and had a magnificent retrospective at the Guggenheim about 6 years ago. By the way, it's spelled U-F-A-N, if you know what I'm talking about. It's pronounced in Korean Joan. But anyway, the point is, I think that this artist, Yoon Hyung-gun, is the great dansakwa painter. Dansakwa means monochrome in Korean, but it's monochrome with a political edge, because keep in mind that when Yoon Hyung-gun was pouring these paintings in the early 70s, that they were under a military dictatorship. And that military dictatorship ended in 1980 with what's known as the Kwangju Massacre, in which over 600 Korean people were murdered, okay? It was a very tense time in Korea. And somehow this work becomes a statement of faith. This is the combination of ultramarine and burnt umber, okay, that's poured together. And for Yoon, the idea was bring the earth and the sky together. Bring this statement, going back to the Goryeo dynasty, which was the great Buddhist epic before the dynasty of 1392, the Chosun dynasty. Anyway, the point is that it's a real statement of faith, and he was very much opposed to the dictatorship, as were all of these artists. And so they are trying to hold on to their tradition, okay? Not just producing, souvenirs or whatever, not just trying to copy the West. They were doing their own work, and some of this work is extraordinary. Let's see if, I want to try and get back to that, okay. Anyway, it's difficult to see. The edge is very thin, and then it kind of bleeds off, and then there's just the space. It's, keep in mind that we're talking about the early 70s now that this work was being done. This is extraordinary. And at that time, Korea was fairly locked out in terms of Western influences. That didn't happen until considerably later, in contrast, for example, to Japan and Taiwan. This is Kim Suzha. And I show you a picture because people read the name and they don't know whether it's a woman or a man, and she is indeed a woman artist. And she went to a very important school in Seoul, Korea, called Hongik University, which is an art university, which is quite extraordinary. There's been a very strong feminist movement in a neighboring university in Korea called Iwa, where I have lectured at, happily. And Iwa has taken a very strong position in terms of getting back to the women's situation in Korea, rather than transporting Western theory over to Korea. Obviously, there are others who have the opposite point of view. They are trying to integrate Western theory with Korean tradition in terms of the women's situation, and it's very, very different. Anyway, what I want to show you of Kim Suzha is her botari. This is a truck that she drove throughout Europe and in parts of Korea as well. Botari are these very colorful fabrics, and they are, inside the botari are the woman's possessions that are tied at the top into a bundle. And from Kim Suzha's point of view, the history of Korean women as a sign of the universal is contingent upon understanding the botari, because the botari suggests excommunication from the family. In other words, these are the possessions that they are taking with them. Now, there's some controversy as to whether that is the total meaning of the botari, but from her point of view, that's the way she understands it, and I think it's quite extraordinary. I want to show you, I've been going to China a great deal over the past few years. This is a photograph of Wang Dongling. Wang Dongling is in Hangzhou, which is in the southeast of, say, Shanghai, for example. It has the oldest school, art school there. And he is now the chairman of the calligraphy and painting. And he was recently at the Brooklyn Museum, where he had a standing only crowd. This is not Brooklyn. This is in Hangzhou, where he's performing some of the texts of Chuanzi, who was a follower of Lao Tzu and the Taoists. Anyway, he uses a large brush, as you can see, and he will cover this whole area with this extraordinary calligraphy. And he will do it within the space of an hour. He's 70 years old now, and he works, he's unbelievable, the amount of space that he can cover with this perfection and precision of the brush. Now, people have asked me, what is different about when Asians, for example, like Yun Hyung-gun, or we're looking at the calligraphy, and I'm going to show you a painting in a moment by Wang Dongling. What is different about what they're doing from abstract expressionism? Well, to simplify it, and this is a gross simplification, whereas from Western, particularly American point of view, emphasis is on the surface. In China, emphasis is on the brush. Okay, very different point of view. Okay, very different point of view. Now, of course, the surface is something that you contemplate, but you only contemplate it when it's without a stroke. The rest happens with the energy that is coming from the brush, as we are going to see right here. This is not a character. It is a painting, and Wang Dongling believes that it is time to bring calligraphy out of the character into a state that it can work with contemporary architecture, essentially. Contemporary spaces, that it can be an object of meditation, but not contingent upon the character. And some of this work is absolutely extraordinary to see in real time and in real space, completely contingent on the tactile sensation that I am trying to emphasize tonight. And I want to show you a younger artist, a bit younger. He's now in his early 50s. This is Zheng Chongbin. He is an expressionist with ink, probably even more than Wang Dongling. I think that Wang Dongling relies heavily on a kind of structure of being that he projects in relation to the ink and the brush. But in the case of Zheng Chongbin, I think that it's more within the realm of the intuitive, also combined with certain ideas of minimal modularity. And the fact that he maintains studios in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, and in Mill Valley suggests that he has always wanted to stay in contact with Western ideas of painting, but he still maintains his own idea in relation to what he has learned from the West. Okay, I think what we can do, can we just get the light, let's see, is there one? I think there's one more slide. No, there is one more slide, yes, there it is, okay. This is a beautiful piece by Zheng Chongbin. I was out there about a week and a half ago looking at the work that we're going to put in the Armory this year, and I just think this is absolutely extraordinary. I'm so taken by this work. Anyway, if we can have, can we get the light back on for a moment? Because I just want to talk to you for a minute, and then I want to show you the clip that I brought along with me. Now, I want to put this in a little bit larger context. We've been talking so far about the experience of art and what has happened in terms of selected artists that I have decided to talk about that I feel are important for various reasons, that have been indicative of the time and that manifest this notion of touch and this kind of internalized heuristic point of view in terms of how they're thinking in relation to the work. I want to go back to structuralism for a moment, and I'll try and make this as simple as I can. Some of you may be familiar with the Swiss child psychologist. His name is Jean Piaget. He came out with a book on structuralism, translated into English in the early 70s. And he was talking about two forms of structure that both intersect at various times. One is the diachronic, which in terms of history, diachronic refers to a chronology. Now, most of us who studied art history, for example, in American universities, we understood that there was a chronology, okay? That there would be, for example, neoclassicism, there would be romanticism, there would be plein air painting, there would be impressionism, there would be post-impressionism, there would be fauvism, that kind of thing, okay? That's diachronic, okay? Where over the span of a century, those different forms are dealt with, okay, in terms of an idea. Now, Piaget also talks about the synchronic, which runs perpendicular to the diachronic. In other words, what happens with the synchronic is that there are different things going on, politically, artistically. For example, what was happening with the French painters, you know, was not what was happening with the German painters or with the Italian painters, or for that matter, what was happening in places in Africa, like Senegal, or places in the United States, like New England. In other words, all of these places, painting was happening, okay? But it wasn't the same thing, but it was happening at the same time. Now, what I would like to suggest, and by the way, he has taken this idea, Piaget has taken this idea from observations of child psychology in terms of this chronological sequence, in terms of the pre-operational and the operational and so forth, and talked about moments of synchronic evolution where the child becomes aware of simultaneity, several things going on at the same time. But he applies this to history as well. Now, the point that I would like to make is I think it's becoming more and more difficult to identify contemporary art because we live in a world that is totally at our fingertips. We can see in instants what is going on anywhere in the world, okay? Now, what is more contemporary than something else, okay? There are more than 200 official nations now, and God knows how many cultures are going on in the archipelago in Indonesia, which there are, you know, how many 2,000 islands, okay? Each with their own language, their own culture, and so forth. And all of this is hypothetically at our fingertips today. What I'm saying is that we are in the age of the synchronic, that we have to begin to think differently about art and about our experience of art based on the fact that we truly are in this kind of global environment, and that is happening faster in terms of our awareness of what's going on in this global environment than the kind of old idea of sequencing that identified the field of art history. Art history, and in fact, I would go so far as to say the whole concept of history is changing rapidly as a result of the new technology. Now, what are the implications for the future of art? I think that given this virtuality that is so prevalent in the world today, and we see it even in the most intimate recesses of our daily lives, public and private, okay? What I am advocating is that we begin to hold forth in terms of what I call tactile resonance. In other words, how we feel something. Now, feeling is based on touch, and within the realm of touch is knowledge, not information, but knowledge, okay? We have a lot of deep knowledge as human beings, and we have deep emotions as human beings, and therefore, I see a kind of, for a better word, responsibility for art, because it's not going to happen through the media, to keep us alive and aware of the tactile resonance. Now, writing, what's happening to that? 2-year-olds are getting computers, okay? Are they learning to write? Think about this. Neurologically, the process of writing connects directly with the brain. I call it sensory cognition, okay? It's a great way to learn. And if there is no sensory cognition, there is no memory, okay? We have to have that mind-body thing going on where, in fact, we are thinking in the act of writing. What's going to happen to these children? You can't go back once you get to the age of 18 and learn longhand unless, I mean, how is that going to happen? tell me how that's going to happen. But it can happen in terms of pressuring schools to teach writing, which, you know, I have to say part of my background is I have an advanced degree in education as well, and I've always brought that into my work as an artist. I think this is important, that whether we're talking about English or Chinese, there are Chinese people who cannot write the characters. They should be writing the characters, but they can't, okay? I can write some of the characters, but they should be able to do much more than I can do, okay? It's important to the mind, it's important to our sensory operations and to our mental capacity in terms of cognition and memory. This is what art is capable of doing. Whether it does it or not is something else. Now, I want to show you a clip from, about a 2-minute clip from a film by Gerhard Richter. And just as an introduction, I have to say that many of the ideas that I get from Richter have come by way of Kierkegaard and Martin Buber. But anyway, we're going to see that clip, and then we'll open it up if you have any questions.
Klappt nicht. Das
Klappt nicht heute?
ja. Also ich kann das nicht draufspielen, das ist ein Irrtum.
Das Blaue?
Ja. Dass wir über den Film reden, ne?
Mhm. Was passierte denn dann, wenn Sie das da drauf schmieren würden?
Ja, da ist es ganz kaputt. Das war übertrieben, jetzt sowas da drauf zu streichen.
Aus Ratlosigkeit, oder?
Ja, das ist ja immer. Das wäre nicht das Problem, aber das geht nicht.
Thank you very much.